Okay,
show.
so I'm not gonna spoil anything if you've read the books, all of them, right?
Yes.
Okay, and,
Oh, I'm just interested in your method. I'm very interested in
Okay.
your method. So
So
I
you
don't
don't-
think I even need to know the story.
okay, so you don't mind if I spoil the story?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I don't wanna spoil anybody who's like, oh, I really wanna see it, but, okay. So, what we're gonna do today is basically look at the author's chart and identify themes in his chart and see how those themes are reflected in his work. And this is fascinating if you've never seen anybody do this, and I'm not the first one to do this. There have been other astrologers who've done this with Star Wars and with George Lucas's chart. I think it was Glenn Perry who did. And so it's very fascinating to see the same themes come up. So, so I am going to spoil the story, just so you know, up until the present books. We are going to focus more on the books than the show, because the show has kind of veered away from the books, and the author is the person who wrote the books, so obviously his themes are going to show up in the books more so than in the show. If you're new to astrology, which it doesn't seem like anybody here is, don't worry that if you see something similar in your chart, it doesn't mean you're going to be like burning children at the stake, having incest with your twin brother. So it's there are multiple ways in which things can manifest.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. So,
She'll say.
okay, so obviously spoilers, when people worry about this for the whole show. So we're gonna alternate between how it shows up in his life and then how it shows up in the show. So this is George Martin's chart. And we're gonna go around starting with the moon in Aries, and we're gonna go down and look at each of the planets, and then sequentially and cover some of the themes, the greater themes in the show. Can everybody see this okay?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the moon. So the moon in Aries is in the 12th house. And I want to start with what the moon actually represents as a principle. All the planets have principles. And I learned the principles from someone called Robert Schmidt, I'm a traditional astrologer by training. I started off as a psychological astrologer. I use a lot of traditional ideas and methods, and so I will be using a lot of that, what I learned in traditional astrology. So I will be using more traditional rulerships. So the principles that each planet is associated with come from Robert Schmidt's translations of the classical literature. And each planet has a principle, and the principle for the moon is reception. So the sun is selection, the moon is reception. Now what does that mean in real life? Well, what it means is that we are receiving the world, just like what the moon does with light. Light is very important as an idea, as a concept in understanding the moon and the sun. And so what the moon does is it receives the light from the sun, captures it, and then reflects it back into the world. Now, anybody here have heard of the Gauquelin studies? Michelle Gauquelin? In Michelle Gauquelin's studies, the moon was associated with writers. It was statistically correlated with writers at the angles of the charts, just like he has, the moon at the angle. And writers of fiction, not, scribes who write accounting manuals, but writers of fiction. And why? Because writers of fiction have this ability to capture the world, reflect it back in literature in great detail. And so that is why the moon was associated with writers, just like it is in his chart. So as a light principle, it has to do with this ability to receive the world, in order to receive the world, you have to be invested in it. So it automatically implies that you are invested in the world. And when you invest in something, you create an emotional bond with it. That's why the moon and reception leads to emotions. So there's this, when you become invested and kind of connected with what you receive and take in, you become protective of it because you're emotionally invested. So that's how the moon leads to this idea of protection. So we get from reception to emotions to protection through the moon. And that principle is abstract in its most abstract form as a principle, and then in its more psychological form in the human being as emotions and protection. When you're closed off to the moon, when you have problems with the moon, some kind of affliction, particularly from Saturn or Mars, it becomes difficult to become emotionally connected to things or emotionally invested in things, or even to, the receiving principle implies inability to listen or to see even, or to pay attention. So it has to do with the mind as well.
That's true in transit as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, I know a person who, I've actually heard of other people, it's not the first person, who has a Moon-Mars cazimi, very tight, and they have a lot of difficulty listening, hearing. It's the listening or reception principle is cut off. So, so the moon in life, the iconic moon is the mother. Why? Because the mother is the one who must protect the children. So she is emotionally invested, right? And must protect. She's a protector, which is what the moon ultimately becomes when it's very attached. Has anybody seen the movie Bird Box? That movie is a great example of moon, of a lunar archetype, because when you first meet the character that Sandra Bullock plays, she's depressed. She's cut off from the world. And she, the whole movie is about these alien invasion, and in order to survive, you have to be blindfolded, otherwise you end up killing yourself. So it's this idea about, and she only becomes emotionally attached to things when she gives birth to a child. And so she has to protect these children, and she learns this lesson even while being blindfolded. So it's about closing off, but discovering that you were closed off. So it's a really good...
It's a relatively new one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking it up. Okay.
Yeah, it's
All right.
new, it's on Netflix.
Okay.
It's really good. So it's great if you want to learn principles from popular fiction, which is what we're talking about. So, okay, so the moon in Aries in the 12th house. So let's talk about Aries. We talked about the moon. What is Aries? Aries is the first sign. So it always automatically implies fresh starts, beginnings. Aries, because of when you're born, so the fresh start is the birth, when you're born, everything is difficult because you're a newborn and you haven't figured things out yet. So you're automatically put in a survival mode in a contentious environment. Usually when you see Aries, every sign represents a need. And the reason it's the need that it represents is because something is lacking. And usually with Aries, what's lacking is individuality. You're just born, you're coming into the world, and so you have to create your own individuality and survive as an individual being. To do that, as a newborn, it's hard because it's new. So the need for Aries, wherever you find Aries on your chart, there's usually fresh starts involved, but there's also a need for independence and autonomy, because that's what individuality is. It's independence and autonomy from the greater whole that you've just come out of through birth. So when you find this principle, the moon is being receptive in this type of environment. Now let's get to this 12th house. What is the 12th house? The 12th house traditionally is the house of exile. Now, where that idea comes from, it's also the house of hidden enemies. And this idea comes from, and I did my master's thesis on this, comes from Babylonian astrology. And in the houses, their meanings actually go back to Babylon. Even though the ascendant doesn't show up until Hellenistic Egypt, the meanings of the houses actually go further back. And I've argued this in talks. And so when you go to Babylon and you look to the southeast, which is where the 12th house is, it's in the southeast part of the chart, what you see is the Zagros Mountains. So this idea of being, and behind that were the hidden enemies of the Babylonians, the Elamites. And so this idea, that's also where the sun rises, the new sun rises. And so this idea of hidden enemies and being behind something is very much tied to the 12th house. So what the 12th house signifies is exile, because that's where a lot of the captured and hidden enemies would capture the Babylonians, and they would go into exile sometimes in that area. So that whole idea is they are traditionally in this house. This will become important in Game of Thrones. I'll come back to that. But in modern times, what it means is that you're cut off in the 12th house. Imprisonment is another theme for that house. You're cut off. It doesn't mean it's bad, because a lot of what we do in modern society is we don't see, we're cut off, but we do a lot of our work through the internet, not seeing. So this idea of being behind something, behind a veil and being cut off, or even in Vedic astrology, foreign lands had to do with this. Not that you were there, but you were cut off from those lands and you couldn't see them. So that whole idea is there in the 12th house. So how does this translate into Martin's life? So George Martin, I don't know if anybody looked into his biography, but he actually said this. He said it in an interview. His mother, he was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, and he came from a very wealthy family in Bayonne who built a lot of stuff in the town. And when the Depression hit, they lost everything, and he had to go live in the projects. So he used to say, I felt like I came from royalty and I was in exile. He said this about his mother's side of the family, the moon, the mother's side of the family. Mm-hmm. So this moon represents his mother and her whole situation, as far as him being in the projects and being poor, and he often said he wanted to escape poverty, and he could only imagine through his imagination, he escaped poverty that way. That is what he did by using the moon as a writer. He received his environment, he reflected it back through his imagination, and he escaped his poverty environment in that way. Now, he does this through Mars. Mars is the planet that disposits Aries, and it's here in the 6th house, and the 6th house is the house of work. So he does this. Mars's principle, we'll come back to that later, but Mars's principle has to do with innovation and being unique. It also has to do with other things, which I'll mention later, but he does this by being innovative in his work. That's how he escapes, and because it's opposite the moon, it reflects back in his writing. It also makes his writing very violent, and the innovation comes in, which I'll mention again when we get to Mars, but it comes in a whole new genre that he is making popular in his writing. So that's in his life. So here's the moon in the show. Now if you look at those themes I mentioned, who is the mother who is in exile in a contentious, violent environment? Daenerys Targaryen, right? And he actually has said, this is one of the only characters that he's related about to his life, he said her character was based on his mom. She is a protector. The moon is always a protector, no matter what sign it's in. Mm-hmm. The moon is never weak in any sign, despite what they tell you in traditional astrology, that if it's in a sign that has no dignity, that it's in weak somehow. It's not. The moon is never weak. No planet is ever weak. They are sometimes corrupted, or they're in environments in which they don't prefer to be, but they're never weak. So the moon is always a perfect principle. It's always, it's archetypes can never be watered down. They're always pure archetypes. But it's in a contentious environment, a violent environment, an environment in which she has to survive, and in which others have to survive. And if we go back to, oh, and by the way, this house also has to do with large animals that you can ride. She is in an environment that is horse lords, right? That the Dothraki are horse lords, animals that you ride, but also dragons. She's the mother of dragons, large animals that you can drive. This house down here is the house of pets, small animals. Mm-hmm. So she is the conquering mother. So the moon is, and why is she's such a great archetype or icon for this particular archetype? Because if the moon is anything, she's flexible, right? Instead of Daenerys, instead of doing like her brother, is married off to some warlord, right? Instead of closing herself off to her environment and becoming like her brother, tunnel vision, I want my crown, Daenerys doesn't do that. She accepts. That's another lunar word, receiving, accepting.
Mm-hmm.
She accepts her environment, she thrives on it, and she turns it to her advantage. Flexibility and adaptability is one of the main characteristics of the moon because it is the fastest moving planet, so it's the most flexible and adaptable planet. So that's a trait of the moon: flexibility, receptivity, and acceptance. She's definitely that. Protector in a contentious environment. She ends up protecting, let me go back. Who does she protect? She protects, what is the sixth house in traditional astrology?
Slavery.
Huh?
Slavery.
Slavery, the house of slaves. She protects slaves. She is motivated. And the motivation for her whole arc, where it originates is the Khal Drogo. She learns to be this Mars figure, and Khal Drogo is this Mars figure. He's the one who owns her environment. He owns the Dothraki Khal. She becomes who she is by emulating Khal Drogo. She becomes a warrior queen, but with a mission to protect, because that's what a good Mars does. Mars is not always a villain, violent person. Usually when Mars fights, he fights to protect things.
Mm-hmm.
So as a mother, she uses what she learns from the Khal to do that. And by the way, this planet here is in fall. It's also with Chiron, who is the wound,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this becomes a warrior who is wounded, which Khal Drogo was. It's in the sign of its fall. Khal Drogo fell literally off the horse. He fell because of her. He is disposited to her, so the reason he falls is because of her actions. That's what happens in the show. So it's very literal what happens here between what she gains from this Mars. So she also is the mother of dragons. That's another one in which she's the moon. Okay, so let's look at another theme here. Okay, this Venus-Pluto in Leo. Okay, so let's talk about Venus. We know what Venus is: love, romance, relationships. The principle of Venus, is attraction. Now, attraction is a principle that works both in Taurus and in Libra. In Taurus, it attracts things and objects so that you can acquire them. Acquiring is a Venus action as a ruler of Taurus. Attraction of people creates relationships. That's the Venus rulership of Libra. So Venus's principle is attracting what you want and bringing it into yourself so you can possess them. Now, it has to do with forming relationships. Pluto is the planet of repression. When you have Pluto-Venus, there's usually a repression of the attraction principle or of relationships. So what you get with this combination is that a relationship is repressed, or the attraction principle or the sexuality is repressed in some way. Now, what house is this? This is the third house of
Siblings.
Third house of siblings. It's in the sign of Leo.
Mm-hmm.
Leo. Leo the lion. It's in an environment owned by lions. Okay. So we have let me get to Martin before I get to the Lannisters. So Martin has this in his sign, in his chart, and in his life. Oh, and by the way, the third house is also the house that has to do with writing documents, right? So what it has to do with is also knowledge, writing, and documents, siblings. Those are all third house things. And what he said is that, so this is an environment, and it's connected to the fourth, so it brings in a place, a physical location. So it's a physical location in which identity, which is a Leo thing, right? The need for identity is the need that Leo represents, to forge an identity that's important. So what it means is that his relationships are going to occur in a place in which writing is important and in which your name matters. And what he said is that he married twice, but he fell in love 3 times. In all of them, he met at writing conventions. And one of those relationships, which is the one that got away, he doesn't say, but if you look on his website, you kind of read between the lines that he was in love with this girl, and it's so funny. Her name, I had her name written. Oh, Lisa Tuttle. Does that remind you of anybody? Lisa Tully? Right. So she ended up marrying someone else, and it was like really, really bad. And he had a very close relationship with her, and it actually was a relationship, which I'll get back to, that had to do where he collaborated with her. But that was one of the relationships that had to be repressed. There's another thing about this house. I don't know if this is true, but I actually found this on the internet, that his sister was interviewed. It was on the internet, so I don't know if this is true. But according to this interview, his sister claims that he used to tell her all the time how much he loved her, and she thought it was really weird, and it would embarrass her. And so, if that's true, then that would explain, kind of like this tampering down of his admiration and love for his sister. I'm not saying he had an incestual relationship with her, obviously, but it's interesting because she said when she saw the show, she was weirded out by that. So that was interesting.
Pluto is very compulsive.
Yes, it's very compulsive. So it's quite fascinating, that whole thing. And let's look back here at the dispositor. So the dispositor of these 2 planets. So a dispositor, or the planet that rules the sign that the other planets are in, explains the actions. So it gives a motive for the action. So the reason why this was repressed was because of this sun. And the sun has to do with decision making, and I'll get to that again in the next slide. But there is a decision around children that causes this repression of this relationship. So I imagine, from looking at this chart, and I don't know this for a fact, but I know that George Martin never had children, and I imagine he made a decision not to have children because of the sun, and that caused some problems in his relationships that he had, according to this. So it'd be nice to confirm that, but he doesn't talk about his private life that much, so we don't know. But it's interesting that the decision involves children here. So let's look at, so here we have the twins and the repressed love, right? You have to kind of keep it. Now with Pluto, it goes into the underworld. Pluto is the god of invisibility. He wears a helmet that makes him invisible, so you don't see this. And so wherever you have Pluto in your charts, there's going to be some kind of hidden element to that house theme. You don't see, what's there. So you don't see this relationship between the 2 siblings, the twins. And actually, more so, Circe embodies this more so than Jamie, because Circe is Venus. There tends to be female icons, right, in mythology and in literature. So you have this repression. The word actually means to put down by force, repress, to drive underground. And there's also the repression of Circe to her other brother, Tyrion. She really tries to manipulate and overpower him. And the love, this relationship, part of the reason it's repressed And she says, you know, love is a weakness, love no one but your children. That's totally Pluto repressing Venus there. And the reason goes back to the sun, because the sun, and if you look at this, the sun is significator of the fourth is the house of the father. Who is it that would have a gas, you know, that would kind of get bent out of shape? It's Tywin Lannister because of the lineage, right? He's all about the lineage and the name Lannister, and he wants to have children that are legitimate and that will carry on the name. So that is one of the main reasons why they have to hide it, that and the fact that it's, you know, obviously not accepted in that society. They were Targaryens maybe, but so okay, I keep going backwards on this. So yeah, so the dispositor, this decision having to do with lineage and children is the reason for that repression. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Saturn, Sun. Now, you will see that they're pretty wide, but in Hellenistic astrology, that doesn't matter. As long as they're in the same sign, they operate together. So that's why I've been going through these pairings. And by the way, I skipped Uranus not because I don't use the outer planets, I do, but they tend to work with the inner planets. So because we're doing themes and we're doing personal themes, that's why I skipped it. But if I were doing this in a reading, I would include it and I would delineate it. But it in the show, it needs an inner planet to be more visible. Otherwise, it becomes more social, on a social level. Okay, so let's go to these two, Saturn and Sun. These are really interesting. So I mentioned the principle for the Sun is the word is selection. Okay, that's Robert Schmidt's word. Why is it selection? Because what the Sun does is it's the opposite of the moon. Whereas the moon disperses the light and sends it out and shines it over a wide area, so it has to do with the public, right? Because it's a wide reflection of light. The sun is like a focus. It targets a particular thing. And to do that, it has to select what it's going to target and ignore the rest. So that's where the selection element of the sun comes in. The sun chooses. It selects and chooses and makes decisions. So it's associated with will, our will. Our will to do, our will to decide, our will to... I call it when I do solar returns, I call it the CEO's chart, because it's the chart of the guy who's going to do of the decisions we have to make in life, and I read the chart from that perspective. So the sun is all about decision making and selecting. Saturn is the opposite of that. So the word for Saturn is necessity. That's the word that Schmidt used, and for a long time I resisted that word, but I understand now why he uses it. I use the word commitment, which does involve Saturn on a more practical level, but the actual principle is necessity. And why is it necessity? Because the Babylonians called Saturn the anti-sun, or the son of the night. Why? Because there's no choice involved. Whatever Saturn does, the commitments it makes, the sun, I'll go back to the sun in a minute, the sun also makes choices and promises. But what Saturn does is it makes commitments without really having much choice. There aren't any good options. The light is restricted. When the light is restricted, your choice is narrow. So Saturn restricts light. It's a planet of darkness, and so you don't have a choice. You don't have very good choices. So what happens when these two come together? So let me go back to the sun now. I read this article about solar deities in NCGR, I think it was many years ago. And I researched solar deities and antiquity and found that they're all associated with oaths and making promises. Why do you think that whenever they would make a contract or they would make a promise or swear an oath, why do you think they swore it to the sun god? Anybody have any idea?
Well, to gain the sun god's favor.
Yeah, but there's a specific reason. Why the sun? Because what does the sun always do? It
always
always,
comes up.
it always rises. It's reliable. So if you make a promise under the sun, you're saying this promise is as good as gold, gold being the element of the sun.
Right.
So it's as reliable as the rising of the sun every day.
Okay.
So these solar deities are talking about oaths and promises made. Now, that doesn't come up too much in modern days because we don't go around making oaths, but it does come up as intent, our will to do something, our intention, our promises. You can make a promise under the sun. Now, what happens when they combine is that you make an oath, but there isn't any good choices. You're kind of forced into making a promise that you would rather not have made. And this is a theme that comes up over and over and over again in the show, and it comes up with kings, because the sun rules kings. So what you get is these oaths being made that are often broken, and it's in Virgo. Virgo is the sign of broken things. It's the sign of things you want to fix. That's why Virgos are always trying to fix things or improve things or make things better. They're not being annoying, although they can come across as annoying. But John Frawley called Virgo the mosquito of the zodiac. I like that. I have a moon in Virgo, but I understand why he said that. So the Virgo is the need to improve things, to make things better. Wherever you have that sign in your house, that's the area where you want to fix something. If you have it in the 7th, you want to fix a relationship. If you have it, whatever it is. So here, there's a broken promise, oaths being made that you would rather not have made because you didn't have much choice to begin with, and you end up breaking them and having to fix them afterwards. So now in Martin's life, so you get things like darkening of the will, restricted decisions. These are combinations of these two planets. Ignoble decisions. The most obvious one that I can think of in Martin's life has to do with, and realize that the sun is in the 5th house, which is an area of entertainment. He works in the entertainment industry, right? So he's probably had to make lots of promises about, stuff he wants to deliver and now can't. And it rules part of the 3rd house of writing. So, the most obvious one is the books. He's had to, promise to his publishers and to all sorts of people. So that's the most obvious thing, but there are probably other things that have to do with, for example, decisions about having children and restrictions about that. And actually, I believe that it probably, if he did decide not to have children, it probably had to do with his identity as a writer, and also financially, because Mercury is the dispositor, and Mercury rules the 2nd house of money. So I, would think that he probably decided, as a writer, I'm probably not going to make a lot of money, at least in the early years, and maybe that played into his decision about whether or not to have children. In the show, we get broken vows, broken oaths, broken vows, and all these characters have had some instance of that. The most obvious being, I don't know, did anybody think of any of these when I was talking about broken vows? Robb Stark was the most obvious. He was a king when he, promised to marry one of the Frey girls and then broke his oath. And remember, he didn't have very good options when he made that promise. He wanted to cross the river, and the only way he could do it was by promising Walder Frey, and he wanted to do that to save his father. So there was not many good options here for him. The other promise, Ned made a promise to his sister to protect Jon Snow when she was dying in her, giving birth to him, and he didn't have very good options there. If he didn't do this, they would kill the child. And he became ignoble in breaking his vows, which he really didn't break, right? He pretended to break his vows to protect this son, to make another vow to his sister. So that's another broken vow. Jaime has broken lots of vows, the most obvious one to the Mad King being in the King's Guard.
Yeah, he was known as the Kingslayer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So he made, and actually, he was put in the King's Guard, it wasn't even by his choice. King Aerys put him in the King's Guard just to piss off Tywin Lannister, because he didn't like Tywin. He had a thing for Tywin's mother, and in the books, and that's not in the show, but. So Jaime didn't even really have a choice in being in the King's Guard, but yeah. Jon Snow, so here's the oath he made. I actually have it here. To the Night's Watch. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns, win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch for this night and all the nights to come. Did he break his vow?
He died.
He died. He technically got off because he died.
A loophole.
It's a loophole, right? But he kind of did break his oath, but because he died, he kind of was let off.
Wait, so are you saying the broken part of the broken vows comes from the Virgo?
Yeah, it comes from the Virgo, and it also comes from this Saturn being a tainting of the vow. Because what Saturn does is it makes the oath ignoble, less than noble. So it restricts the decision making, where you have to decide about something you'd rather not decide about, you know. Sometimes decisions are easy. The hard decisions are the ones where you have few good choices. And that's what Saturn does. It makes the decision making narrow, so you have no good choices. And so when that happens, the likelihood of you breaking your oath is pretty high. And if it's in Virgo, more likely, because then there's a real big problem in keeping your oath. So yeah, it's a combination of the Virgo and the Saturn. Okay, so Mercury and Neptune, co-presence. Again, they're wide. They're called co-presences in traditional astrology and Hellenistic when they're wide like this. It just means they're in the same sign. So Mercury and Neptune. So let's talk about Mercury as a principle. The principle of Mercury is communication. So what you get is a desire. That one's pretty obvious. This is a desire to communicate, to learn, to communicate what you've learned, to research. All those things are Mercury. With Neptune, well, let me go back to let's do the sign first. So it's in Libra. And the Libra environment has a need. All the signs are needs. And all the signs, by the way, I'm eventually going to write this out, but all the signs are compensating for the sign that came before. So when the sign that comes before becomes exaggerated, and you go to the next sign, it tries to compensate for that exaggeration of the previous sign. So what you get with Libra, because it comes after, well, I'm not going to go into that would take too long to explain, but let's just say that Libra feels a need for balance. It's the scales, right? Now, when you have a need for balance, it's because balance doesn't exist. Needs are always trying to fix something that doesn't exist. So the need for balance means that something's imbalanced. Why is the scales a symbol of justice? It's a symbol of justice because two sides are represented. But it doesn't mean that justice is served. It means that justice is that two sides are represented. You have both sides. And why do I say that justice is not served? Because it's trying to compensate for something that's out of balance. And what happens is, and this is another reason why justice is not served, justice is represented by the sun. The sun was the deity of justice. It was the Lord of making things right. And the sun has its fall in Libra. Do you know what the glyph of Libra is? This
The
glyph?
setting sun.
It's the setting sun. Because the sun falls in Libra. It has its fall in Libra. So that is not justice served, that's justice fallen. So Libra is trying to rectify that, is trying to make things even and balanced. Now remember, so Mercury, okay, so that's the need, and this is going on in the 6th house, cusp, that's where Libra is, but it involves the 5th. So we have a combination here of 5th and 6th houses. But it's a house of, so 5th in his life is entertainment industry, 6th is work. So there are going to be lots of representations of two people in his, so collaborations in his work life in the entertainment industry. And many of those will not seem fair to him. They will be imbalanced. He'll try to make them balanced. And so, okay, so Mercury again, writing, communicating. What does Neptune do? So Neptune makes everything ill-defined. So while Saturn defines things, Neptune blurs all the edges away. And what Neptune does is, because it blurs the edges, you don't see limits. It's kind of, limitless. And so what you get with Neptune and Mercury is you get combinations like words being malleable, words being slippery, communication not being precise, or knowledge being unbounded, right? No limits to knowledge. You get nefarious or confusing or misleading communications. But you also get an expansion of the imagination, right? Because it's also opposite the moon, that has to do with the imagination. And so that's coming out in his writing. And one of Martin's problems in working for Hollywood, and this is why he wrote the books, he said, was that budgets were constraining to his imagination in Hollywood. He couldn't make what he wanted. His mind is just too big. And so he wanted to write about everything and all this research that he does, and he just doesn't stop. He doesn't, have limits. And so and again, limits budget, Mercury rules the 2nd house. So it was difficult for him to write in under those constraints. So that's one of the ways it came out in his life. So let's look at in one of the people who represents this Mercury Neptune. Captivating communicators, right? Also slippery words and witty, and also, Neptune, because it blurs, is often associated with drinking. And I would wonder about, writers who have Mercury-Neptune combinations, because just like Tyrion, they drink and they know things. And this quote is good because it exemplifies this Libra, right? When he says to Oberyn, if you want justice, you've come to the wrong place. He's the only character that's been on trial twice so far. He may actually be on trial again. Who knows? We're not done with the show yet, or the books. But he's definitely been on trial twice for things he didn't do, and no justice there, right? This also exemplifies his keen, curious mind, wanting to know, where he says to Jon Snow, my brother has a sword and I have my mind, and mine needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. That's why I read so much Jon Snow. I'm not particularly good at violence, but I'm good at convincing others to do violence for me. So he's a good talker. So he's a good example of this, but there's another good example of Mercury Neptune. Bran, right? Do y'all see why? He is omniscient, practically speaking. He doesn't see the future completely, but from what I gather from the show, I don't know if that's true in the books, but he does can see through the weirwood net, right? So he has access to lots of information, boundless knowledge, blurs definitions. And here's another really interesting thing. This is kind of creepy in how cool it is. So we know that 5 is children. We know that 6 is illness. So here's a child with an illness. And what is the illness? Libra rules which part of the body? The lower back. So
Kidneys.
here's a child with an illness in the lower back, kidneys and in this area here. So that's kind of interesting. It really reflects well this combination.
Oh, in his life, Martin? We're looking at Martin's
No,
chart.
actually, yeah, in Martin's chart, but this is how it's reflected in the show. through the
I'm
character.
just interested if he has back issues.
Oh, yeah, he may very well. He may very well have it. Yeah, because it's on the cusp of the 6th. That would be something to look at. Yeah, let me see. Where was I here? Oh, Brian Stark, okay. So, boundless unlimited knowledge. He's a green seer. He's a 3-eyed raven. Mental permeability is another Mercury, Neptune thing, and he works into other people's minds, so he can permeate other people's minds. And we've seen him do that with lots of, and Hodor, across time and space. Now, the dispositor of this planet is Venus, so the reason that it does this is Venus, and remember Venus goes back to the Venus-Pluto relationship that gets repressed. The reason he is the 3-eyed raven, because he fell out of a tower because of a decision that they made to protect that relationship that was secret, the Lannisters. So it ties back to the reason is reflected in this chart. Okay, so let's go to the Mars Chiron. I'm almost done. So Mars Chiron is the wounded warrior, right? Because we have the warrior I mentioned earlier, and then we have Chiron, the wounded healer. Now, Chiron is wounded, but he also heals. So there's a healing that occurs. This is the redemption that we see through Jamie. We see it through a lot of people. But let's look at in George Martin's life. This has to do with the breakup of a relationship. Now, the Scorpio is the need for purging. Whenever you have Scorpio in the chart, that's an area where you need to purge what's not working. Something's become toxic there, and you need to purge. And so if you have Mars there, that's really good because you actually can do it. You can break, because Mars is a breaking, the separation principle is the principle for Mars. Why is it the innovator? Because what Mars does is it breaks from the pack. So it what's the saying? It walks to the beat of its own drum. So it doesn't follow the pack, it goes its own way. And so it can break from whatever's not holding, whatever doesn't work for it. So Mars is the planet we need for this kinds of situations that are toxic. So Mars in Scorpio is breaking, it's a wounded person that's breaking here from a working relationship. And this is the collaboration that he had with this girl that I mentioned, Lisa Tuttle, that he wrote a book with. And I imagine this is how it manifested, at least that time. There were probably other times in his life in which this, it always, planets manifest multiple times in the same, similar ways, same themes. So here, lots of wounded warriors, right? All of them. And they all, oh, and let me go back. Actually, it shows up here. It's in the 6th, 7th, so we get a working relationship, or a relationship that you're in service to, or that you feel obligated to, or you get a relationship in which you're enslaved, right, to someone, like the Masters, like Theon Greyjoy. And it's interesting, Theon Greyjoy is the pet of Ramsay, right? He's like his little hound, and that's a 6th house thing as well, house of pets. So he's a pet relationship. We have the Hound himself, has the name of a pet, but he's also in service to lots, to Joffrey, to, all toxic relationships. Arya is in service to the House of Black and White, also kind of toxic. She gets blinded, she has to, this weird guy, and then that crazy woman who's after her. So these are all examples of toxic relationships you're in service to that you end up breaking out of. And they're all wounded. he's wounded, I won't mention where. He's wounded, she's wounded. And then the ultimate wounded warrior is Jaime Lannister, who's had many toxic relationships. The most obvious one being the one with his sister, but he had the in service to the Mad King Aerys, in service to Robert Baratheon, who beat up his sister, in service to the sociopathic son, Joffrey, who belittles him as well, and then in service to Cersei, who manipulates him and verbally abuses him, I might add, and who sleeps around on him. So really toxic stuff. And he has a redemption arc because he does the healing, at least in the books and in the show, up until this last season, where things kind of got derailed. But yeah, I don't know that whole thing, but
No comment.
and he also made some ignoble decisions. So he kind of embodies the Saturn Sun also. He embodies some of that, but he's definitely this wounded warrior stuff here. So the last one is Jupiter in Sag, so let's talk about the principle of Jupiter. Let me start with the sign. The sign, Sagittarius is a sign that's looking for direction, okay? The arrow, it points in a particular direction. And what you get with Sagittarius is a searching that goes on before you get to the direction. So there's lots of, it's like looking at a map and trying different avenues until you get to the right path. So there's searching going on before you find the direction that the arrow points in. And when you do, because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, you become really certain of it. You're absolutely sure this is it, right? And it can happen many times that you're sure that this is it. And then it's not, and then you search again, and then you become sure that this is it again. So there's a need for direction with Sagittarius. And the planet that seeks it out, that tries to resolve it, is Jupiter. Now Zeus. Jupiter's principle is the principle of confirmation, right? You know, this is it. You're confirming. It's like a green light, Jupiter. So whatever Jupiter touches, it makes it true. It's also a revealer of truths. In fact, it's different from Mercury. Mercury communicates, but Jupiter reveals stuff. So you get great revelations with Jupiter, but you also get like the affirmation or confirmation of something that you know is true. And so it's the planet that helps you to point in a direction. It's the best planet to do that because it's the ruler of Sag. There was an astrologer, Al Morrison, who used to say that Jupiter was the great door opener. And I like that because what Jupiter does is when it confirms a path, it opens a door, and then it opens it up, right? So it expands your direction. Just like when you take a path, you're expanded into a certain part of the world. When it's in the eighth house is a house of death. It's also a house of other things. And the most common thing in our society, it comes up less often as death, but more often as other people's money, because it's the second house from the seventh. And so you get a lot of stuff having to do with money, investments, income, that sort of thing. In his life, there's one thing that it definitely has to do with in life, because of the certainty of Sagittarius, and in this house of death, you sometimes get certainties about religion, especially when the religion refers to life after death. And Martin has been quoted as saying that, let's see. I'll read you what he said about his take on religion. He said, I suppose I'm a lapsed Catholic. You would consider me an atheist or agnostic. I find religion and spirituality fascinating. I would like to believe this isn't the end and there's something more, but I can't convince the rational part of me that makes any sense whatsoever. So he's pretty certain that there is no life after death. But this is a reaction, and you see that it has to do with the Saturn square to here, coming from the fourth house of his family, a conservative kind of thing, and it comes from his mother's side of I think it's his mother's side of the family. And Bayonne was pretty Catholic, so there was a strong Catholic upbringing, and he's kind of reacting to that. So he doesn't have, he has a strong faith that there's nothing after death, strong belief. So in the show, you get this theme play out in many different ways. Right, this sense of righteous judgment, which can come from this combination, this certainty about, and you see that they're all creating. So what Jupiter, as the lord of the eighth house, is that he generates death. Because Jupiter, because all rulers of houses are generators of that house, they create, if they're in the same house, they're creating the thing of the house that they're, here it's affirming and confirming this direction, but also generating in the process, generating that death that is signified by the eighth house. So you get, this guy, what was his name? High Sparrow. Yeah, he is, judging pretty much everyone, including Cersei. You get, this scene with Cersei being judged and, run through this scene. This scene is also a form of righteous judgment because Ned, and you see the searching going on too. You remember in the first season, Ned was like on this detective quest trying to find out the truth. He's searching out the path, the truth, and then he finds it, and then he confronts her with it stupidly, and it ends up costing him his life. He's the judge, and there's righteous. I looked up the word, means passing judgment according to divine or moral law, and he does this in this scene, and it costs him his life. This scene is also horrific, and ends up costing his men and his child. So there's a lot of this theme going on in the chart. Okay, so I don't know if I'm just going to mention this briefly, but before I mention this, does anybody have anything they want to ask or say or comment, or before I tell you my endgame theory? This has nothing to do with the show because I think the show's veered way off of what's in his chart. But
Since I don't know anything about the story, but is there a main character?
no, there's lots of main characters. It goes all over the world. It starts with one main character, but it goes in that direction, and then the focus changes, and it goes in a different direction. So there's lots of different characters that become the focus characters.
And my question too is that like his writing style is really unique. Where like stories start and like they literally break, and you're like
Yes.
somewhere else completely.
I love that about his writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it keeps it like very interesting. I'm wondering if there's like some kind of like pattern, like how did he? Do you know what I mean?
If it's
like,
reflected in the chart, you mean?
yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I think so. Well, go ahead.
Mercury is trying Uranus out of sign. Mercury is trying Uranus
Okay.
out of sign, so
Yeah.
he would go from one landscape
Yeah.
to another just to keep it
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and I think that,
Yeah.
and I think this has something to do with it. I think definitely this, because it's so vast, the world is so vast, there can't be one path. But I also think this, you have your quest, as a solar hero, so that's what the sun does, he traverses. By the way, I don't know, this is really important in understanding the sun. The solar hero stories, like Joseph Campbell talks about, and but in the I did a talk on the Babylonian Gilgamesh. It's a solar hero story, and it's all about going around the world and traversing all these different, and so your path changes. So yeah, this Saturn has something to do with that solar hero story changing also.
Okay, I see.
But yeah, this definitely, and then the Uranus being part of that trine.
But
You
also,
also-
like, what about like directional? Because like I know they travel a lot. I wonder if he looks at maps.
Well,
You know, like if that has anything to do with
Yes.
the landscape.
and there, it actually, I was gonna mention that in this end game slide. There is something here about direction. Okay, down here is the northern part of this chart, right? There's the south, here's the north. Whatever happened, so the angular planets are gonna be the most significant. So I think the ending is gonna have to do with these planets. This planet represents boundaries, walls. It's the coldest planet there is. It's in the most northern part of the chart. It represents the northern wall, right? And everything associated with that, the White Walkers, the whole north of this planet is the king, right? So we have, oh, and by the way, this is the night part of the chart, right? So this is a perfect representation of the Night King, as well as the Kings of Winter, which is what the Starks are called in the books. Their whole lineage is the Kings of Winter. You want to hear something trippy? Okay, so you were talking about asteroids?
Yeah.
I looked up asteroids. Do you know what asteroid is at 26 degrees Virgo, right next to the sun? Wolf. So this represents the North and the Starks, and the Starks are very much connected to the wall as well. Now, this, because it's dispositing this, so I think this represents the Night King, it represents the Starks, and they're connected. This stuff here is in the house of children, the children of the forest. And Bran, who is the greens here, right, is dispositing this, so he is tied to this theme, right? So, from reading this, to make a long story short, so there's also this Libra, and Libras are always associated with pacts, agreements, two sides being represented. The children made a pact. The children created the Night King, that's why they disposit. Bran is working for the children as a green seer, so he's connected to this. And so there's a pact that was made that has, and they talk about this in the books, that has to do with why the White Walkers went away in the first place. And I think that plays into the end of this. I don't know exactly how, but I think Bran is the key to that. He's the key to unraveling what happened and why it's so frustrating that they're not even going to talk about this in the show. But I'm pretty sure this will come up in the books. I sure hope to God it does. Otherwise,
So are the books not done?
no.
They're not. I thought he stopped after the fifth one.
Yeah.
And so then two showrunners continued the story, so they had somewhere to go.
But so he is not going to continue the books the same way the show was.
He may not.
we
Well,
We don't know.
he has said that he told them the end, but he didn't tell them how he gets there. So, and I don't know how much because they are allowed to diverge from the ending.
Why?
So he has his
He's never finished it, that's
Right.
the whole
Is
problem.
he going to?
No one
He
knows,
has.
he's promised it over and over and over again.
Broken promises.
No, it's been going on for years,
Yeah.
and then it just veered off. I read all the books, and then, the story
I did
ended at a
too.
certain point. And he was supposed to write 2 more books, but he hasn't written the next 2.
Yeah. He's written a large part of Winds of Winter, which is the next one. I doubt he'll ever get to the third one, to the last one. There's supposed to be 7.
Yeah.
He's written a large portion of 6, but he's an old guy, and he takes a long time to write. So who knows? It may never happen.
And he's 10 years older than me. I mean, he better hurry up.
Does he need to?
Here's
I
what
mean,
it
He
looks
had
like.
like such a
for
big career before
fulfillment,
that.
I wonder,
I
I mean, it's kind of
Then
carried
he go
on.
down and that's
No,
what
I-
it looks like.
It's his baby that grew
Yeah.
up
No,
without
that's
him.
right.
They
Yeah.
took it,
Yeah.
they continued the story
Yeah,
the way they wanted to,
Yeah, right.
with his permission.
right. But they're writing, you
Yeah,
know,
some
it's hard for
surprises
them
on
to
it.
get in his mind to write exactly
Yeah.
this. So they're writing with a whole different set of priorities than he is, so
Yeah.
it won't come out like this. So, anyway,
So the petition online to get new writers is that
It's
they
not
actually
gonna
want him to write it?
that's not gonna happen, but yeah, they want somebody competent to write, to rewrite the season, like they gotta get all the actors back and redo the whole thing, no, I don't think so. So that's the end of my presentation.
Oh,
Anyone-
oh, I'm sorry, the end
Yeah.
game, I didn't quite get your end game.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that I believe the end of the story is going to revolve around this pact that the children made after they created the White Walkers. Now, the Night King doesn't exist in the books. He hasn't even showed up yet. But the White Walkers do. And so they created the White Walkers, so they are tied to this. But Bran, as a Greenseer, because the Greenseers work for the children, so the idea is that the children were at war with the men, and they had a pact that stopped the war. And the reason that they were at war was because the men were destroying all their trees.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Libra is a sign of deforestation. It's like an open plain. It's a
Wow.
sign of no.
Really?
So the pact had to do with this ceasing of destruction of the trees, and the children agreed to retreat to the forest and live there. And the White Walkers went away because the original Azor Ahai, he didn't die. The White Walkers didn't die. They just went north of the lands of always winter. And so that was the original pact, and something broke that pact. And the only person who would know that is Bran, who can go back and see. So my feeling is that Bran is not as innocent as he seems. And that may come out in the books, I don't know. But I think Bran is still working for the children, and the war hasn't stopped. And the children are still at war with the humans. So that's how I think. And it'll require another pact between them. And the pact may actually require a marriage, because that's what Libra signifies. It may require another, a marriage of some sort, rather than a destruction of the Night King, of the White Walkers. Anything else?
It's
Well,
fascinating.
so I noticed because I'm looking at it here, because I like to look at the little colors and stuff. But so in Placidus, there's intercepted houses. Do you have like
I don't use them.
so you don't use
No.
them?
In Hellenistic astrology, there's only two houses, because we require 30 degrees for each house. And what happens is if you use Placidus or another system, a quadrant system, when you get very far north, everything gets distorted.
Yeah.
So I use only whole sign or equal. I use equal, I prefer equal, but I do a lot of whole sign analysis, as you've been seeing, because I look at the overlap of signs when they overlap two houses. That's my kind of concession to whole sign. I don't use whole sign in drawing the chart, because often if you have late degrees rising, it puts the ascendant pretty low, and it makes it look like the ascendant is not really here, it's down here, so it confuses people. So I use equal for that reason. Equal does everything I want it to do. It keeps the houses 30 degrees, it shows me the exact place where the ascendant is, and it allows me to do whole sign analysis if I need to. So it's the perfect system for what I do. And also there's a system called perfections that gets really thrown off if you don't have 30 degrees per house.
And you do use, I've heard you speak one time before, it was a long time ago. Do you do aspects?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do aspects.
Yeah.
I do, when I do thematic analysis of a natal chart, I do whole sign aspects. So anything between, like, signs, a square would be anything in signs that are square. A trine would be anything in signs that are trine. So the sign is what creates the aspect. When I do timing, I look at actual degrees, and I don't use orbs because I'm always looking for exact. So it makes it real simple.
You don't use words? Is that what you said?
When
For what?
For timing,
So you just use the sign?
I just use I do timing for when the planet actually hits the
Hits
exact
that
degree.
and then like, okay, I see.
And then it makes it simpler.
Be interesting to see if he finishes. There's a lot going on in the heavens that would indicate that he's gonna come out with this next book
I think,
pretty soon. First of all, Saturn and Capricorn,
Yeah.
conjunct Pluto, it's gonna kick his
Have you
Virgo
looked at
ass.
the timing of it?
Huh?
Have you looked at the timing of it?
I'm just looking at
Oh, okay.
the chart right here.
Yeah, I
and
think you're
but-
right.
But also Neptune, coming up to trine
Yeah.
that Chiron.
Yeah, I think you're right, cause I have looked at the timing and
Were
I
the
do think
books-
he will.
Were they, I haven't read them, were they very successful before
Oh,
the
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Before the show?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I read them, way before the show.
I did, I read them twice.
And I had
Yeah.
people tell me about them.
Yeah.
And they're nice and fat, so if you're on a long plane ride.
I read almost the third whole book on a plane.
On a plane, I read the whole first book on a plane. Could you address the fact that he was a conscientious objector
Yeah.
and, during the Vietnam War,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he is probably most well known for one of the more violent, fantasy fiction and science fiction things, in media.
Yeah, but if you look at the, so I never mentioned, I should have mentioned that, the innovation I'm talking about is something called grimdark fantasy. Has anybody ever?
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
didn't know.
It's so he's not the first one to do this, but he popularized it.
Yeah.
And so other people had started writing very realistic fantasy. And what he does is, and that kind of goes to your point, is that he writes war very realistically.
Exactly.
And so that's his attempt at saying that war is not a good thing, because he's
But
showing
he
how.
popularizes it too. And by popularizing, you begin to accept it as a normal.
But I'm hoping, and I see this in the books, and I'm hoping that the end of the show will emphasize, the end of the books will emphasize that, just like Lord of the Rings, he said his favorite thing in Lord of the Rings was the scouring of the Shire, not because it was devastated, but because it showed the devastation of war. And I think that's what he's trying to do with the books. Now, the fact that it's become so popular and that that happens, people misunderstand sometimes literature and they think that, they make light of it and they think, it's a fun, and I think the show to some extent has done this. I'm sorry to say, but I think, and that's just the society we live in which we glorify violence. And so the fact that the show has turned the characters into two-dimensional figures has helped to make a mockery out of what he's trying to do, I think. I'm being kind of hard, but I have a Virgo mood. But I don't think that's his intent. But getting back to in his chart, when he went to, after he graduated, he went to live in Chicago. This was at the time of the draft, and he was drafted, and he was a conscientious objector, and so they gave him an alternate path. He managed to convince the draft board that he was a conscientious objector. I'm sure it was not an easy thing to do, and they gave him a path where he had to do volunteer work. So he went to work for Vista Volunteer, which is a legal advocacy group in Chicago, in the worst possible neighborhood in Chicago, a very bad neighborhood, and it reflects this moon, and actually you see it in the timing exact, in the directions that I used, where the moon had come to the ascendant of his chart at the time that he went there. And so it's this idea of having to do something protective in a contentious environment. So yeah, he's talked about that a lot.
Cool. Wow, this is fascinating.
We're trying to
This
find.
is great.
So one of the things, I don't wanna keep everybody, cause we're kinda late already, but, there's no one here to kick us out.
Oh, well, no, he will. We need to leave soon.
But,
So-
wasn't he,
15 more minutes.
15?
Yeah.
I mean, but a lot of this story comes from other parts of historical like myths and legends.
Yeah, he takes a lot from history.
So then how would one do this? You would pick certain themes or influences, and then you can use your own chart or like use a visual aid, whatever that is. And then maybe with the aspects, you could like have a more dynamic storyline going on.
You mean if he was conscious of his chart?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun to do if he knew enough astrology. But he does this anyway. You know, just like we live our charts.
Accidentally.
We live our
Yeah.
charts anyway, whether we know it. I don't know. There was this fascinating thing one time so there was this, The Simpsons?
Yeah.
So they had this Halloween special where they had 3 different stories. And the first story was something about a guy who killed his father. The second story was like a scientist. And then the third story, I don't remember, but I saw the first 2 and I said, oh, there's a Saturn theme here. I said, if the last one was the scientist. No, the last one was the guy who killed his father. I said, if the last story is something about a father, I'll totally know this is astrology. And it was. It's like the last one was the story. So they had all Saturn themes in all 3 stories. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that they didn't know they were doing that. But they did a whole Saturn theme on The Simpsons without knowing it. And this happens all the time. That's why you can do this kind of thing with literature. Because
And so if the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on the midheaven coming up, because you're talking about the timing of it? So
I'm not talking about transits.
we're not doing transits.
I do transits, but I wasn't talking about transits.
Okay.
I was talking about directions.
Okay.
So-
I see.
Yeah, but you're talking about this coming up here.
Right. I
as a
mean, because
transit.
like the midheaven's up there, and that's kind of like
Yeah.
his midheaven. I guess so. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, and when a Saturn comes to the 10th house area, well, the midheaven is kind of like a pinnacle. You know, so what I use is this is a pinnacle regardless of whether it's in the 10th or not. And if you have the midheaven in the 9th rather than the 10th, your career will involve the 9th a lot. But if you, when you have it come to the 10th house with Saturn, you get commitments made to some kind of business or work environment. And so if that's happening, he may end up doing some kind of project or something, I don't know, which he's been doing all along anyway, but he may make some major commitment. They're always long lasting with Saturn, they're not short term, and they're slow.
Okay.
But the directions that I've been talking to these guys about, we're gonna have a little session. When you start off with a rising sign, it actually is not your rising sign forever. You actually direct through, and you get at most, because it's like about 1 degree per year on average, you get about 3, depending on how fast these signs move, and they don't all move at the same speed, but you can get as much as 4 signs in a lifetime. So as you go through this, you notice big time the shifts. So when you direct into the new sign, he's now, I looked it up, I believe he's now in Cancer. So when you get, and it makes sense because he's been in Cancer for a long time, and the moon rules Cancer, so that's when his writing is going to be most, and it's in the 3rd house of writing. So it's obvious this is going to shine, and because it's in, and this moves also, so this becomes angular during his lifetime, and so angular planets are more impactful. So yeah, don't think if you have a crappy rising sign, you're stuck with it forever, because it'll change. Anything else?
Lots of wonderful information, thank you.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much.
All right.